So this is the third and final video of our series on better education, and in this video, let's talk about assessment. Previously, we talked about how prescribed curricula determines the way we teach, and we suggested surrendering both the curriculum and our pedagogy to the control of children. Well, those same prescriptions to what and how we teach also affect how we assess student learning. The sheer number of topics that need to be covered and hence monitored for student learning inevitably lead to the kind of assessments that cater to rote learning. Take math, for example. Over the course of one grading period, several topics may be covered, which may include several theorems, several formulas, several procedures. Students, knowing they will be tested on remembering these information, repeat the information to themselves over and over again until they have memorized it. The ordinary math class helps them through this process by requiring students to do drills, exercising their ability to follow specific procedures until they have ingrained the procedure enough to repeat it robotically on the test. Now, because you can never go too deeply into a topic, teachers can really only ask the kind of questions that require students to recreate what they have been shown in several examples on the board. This is easily accomplished with enough practice. After all, the whole point of practice is to reduce the need to think. Then, having passed the test and ultimately the subject, the student is now free to forget everything they memorized until they need it again for another test. For many teachers, teaching means giving students information to remember for a test. We even emphasize this to them by saying things like, remember this will be on the test. And there always seems to be some kind of test on the horizon, be it a quiz, a quarterly exam, an entrance exam, a licensure exam. Very often we judge the success of our teaching on the outcomes of these tests. This is why teachers teach as if they are preparing a generation of test takers or game show contestants, under the assumption that students need to be tested frequently in order to know if they are learning. Now, there are two main reasons why we give tests. One is to know how much students have learned, which ties into the second reason, which is to determine students' grades. Now, we've already covered grades on this channel and how they can have a detrimental effect on learning. Insofar as testing for grades are concerned, tests only reinforce the competitive nature of schooling and serve as the threatening component to force children to learn the things we are making them learn, even if it doesn't interest them. Every child knows that tests are a really boring reason to learn something. It's because of this that John Holt wrote, our chief concern should not be to improve testing, but to find ways to eliminate them. But let's look at that first reason, which is to monitor student learning. Okay. When we test students, we often test their ability to remember information. And when you have to check the progress of 40 students to a class, it's very difficult to make tests which are creative. Instead, we have to design the questions in such a way that we can reasonably expect every answer to be the same. Sometimes, we even limit the range of possible answers, for example, by giving multiple choice exams. After all, those are the easiest exams to check. But the truth is, those kinds of tests are very bad at telling us how much students have learned because students have a tendency to forget what they have learned once the threat of the test is out of the way. Being able to regurgitate information for a test does not indicate permanent learning. When it comes to learning, it's not what they remember now that matters, but what still sticks years after they have left the classroom, which obviously is not something we can test. A student who passes an exam does not mean they have learned the material, just as those who have failed a test may simply need more time to learn. Now, we should note that in the age of information, it is not remembering facts that matter, but our ability to interact with those facts. And it would be very difficult to design, not to mention to check, a test that assesses a student's ability to think and use information creatively. Another problematic aspect of how we test students is that we give all students the same tests and judge them according to the same standards in the name of fairness. We demand that they learn certain things by a certain time, or else they will be penalized through their grades. But many teachers are familiar with that famous quote. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. It means every individual has unique skills and abilities, and therefore we should judge every person differently according to different standards. Every teacher worth their salt is aware of this concept, and yet we still insist on giving every student the same tests on the same content and judging them by the same standards. Now, I'm not saying there should be no standards. There should. And there should be high standards of learning. We need standards. We do not need standardization. Our standards should be individualized. If the purpose of testing is to find out how much a student has learned, we do not need tests to do that. Students do not need a test to know if they are not learning something. They just know, I guarantee it. We could simply ask them. If the point is to give students feedback to help them improve on their learning and not simply to pass judgments with regards to grades, it will be more effective to simply ask each student one by one what they need help on. What do they not understand? But this only works if there are no penalties for not learning things in a prescribed manner. Now, a quick digression. We should be careful when our motivation for changing education is driven by test results, like PISA. That's where George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind and Obama's Race to the Top programs went wrong by emphasizing test scores over real learning. Changing education must not be about test scores, but about the learning. When Mark Twain said, "I have never let my schooling interfere with my education," he asserted that there are things in school that distract us from learning. I argue, chief among those distractions are our tests. When the central focus of teaching becomes the preparation for and the outcomes of tests become a distraction from learning. Now, I've already talked about what teachers can do in graded environments to de-emphasize scores and grades in their classroom. I'll put a link to that video in the comments, but here are a few more authentic assessment methods that teachers can also implement. For subjects like math, physics, chemistry, and programming that require learning computational skills, assessments can move away from the grades orientation in two simple ways. One, students must have available to them several meaningful assessments of varying degrees of difficulty, testing different skills and topics they need to learn, on which they can test their own progress anytime they determine they are ready. Their scores may be noted but are not recorded for the purpose of grading. And then second, allow students to retake these assessments as many times as they need until they reach a negotiated quota, like say 5 tests at 90% per term, which gives the students a concrete goal to aim for. Taking these steps can redirect attention away from the penalties of not learning quickly back to the process of learning itself. Now, for as long as the teacher does most of the assessments, students will learn to depend on the teacher to know what they need to know and to know what they do not know. One path away from this trend is to instead teach our students to assess their own work. This can be done in a variety of ways, but the simplest is to present our students with some standard output by which they can compare their own. We could provide them with descriptions in detailed sentences of the characteristics of a good output and ask them to identify whether those characteristics are present in their own work. Now, this is not a rubric, mind you, as a rubric is meant to assign points for each bullet point. This is just a checklist with no scores attached. This could also include peer assessment so that they get feedback on their work from other people who are not the teacher. This method is especially useful for subjects like language, the arts, history, the humanities. So, a person who is learning to play the violin, for example, does not need a test to know if they are improving or not. They know simply by comparing themselves to some standard performance to see how far they have to go. Learners do not need ratings of their performance, but instead concrete feedback of what they have to improve and what to do in order to make those improvements. So another practice that schools can do is called portfolio-based assessment. In this form of assessment, students are asked to defend their progress over an entire term before a panel of evaluators, which may include a teacher, a classmate, a parent, and an outside expert. Student progress is weighed according to where each individual started at the beginning of a term compared to the level they reach at the end of a term. Students present selections from their entire body of work before the evaluators, meant to demonstrate their learning and create a narrative of their educational journey. Each student is asked to reflect on their learning, what went right, what went wrong, what they could have changed, what they will address in the future, whether they think their learning satisfies a certain standard. As part of this portfolio, students also work on a culminating project, or what amounts to a mini thesis, through which they demonstrate the variety of skills and knowledge they developed over the course of a term. It may be a report or paper on some topic, an experiment or research undertaking that is also presented to the panel for evaluation. Portfolios may be compiled for one subject or a combination of subjects and are graded on a strictly pass, edit, redo, or fail basis. If a grade is still required by the system, instead of the teacher alone rating the student, we could invite the student into the grading process by letting them negotiate the grade they will get. In this way, the grade is not just a meaningless number that ranks them among their peers, but we could actually make it make sense to them, make them understand what it is they still need to work on. So here's an example of portfolio-based assessment as practiced in Mission Hill School, founded by the great Deborah Mayer.
How do we know what children are learning?
Tell me about the number you made.
Our current education policies point to a narrow measure of success, high-stakes reading and math scores. But teachers at Mission Hill use a variety of ways to get concrete, thoughtful feedback about teaching and learning, which applies to teachers as well as students. The word assess comes from the Latin to sit next to. Standardized tests are administered at Mission Hill, but teachers here find that direct contact and conversation are the most accurate way to judge if a child has mastered a skill or concept.
And that's what I expect from you, is greatness, Linnea. So when I'm pushing...
Any inappropriate language? No.
Or to figure out a new strategy to help them on the path to greater understanding.
Look at what a great morning you had. Look at that. How does that feel?
Afternoon, I think that's good.
Usually when you write, you get like a word, you get a couple sentences. Look at today. That says it all, Caleb. Feels good, right?
You did know. That's you. You got it. I end up with files of work because ultimately I'm someone who really believes in portfolio-based assessment. I really believe in looking at a student's work as the best indicator. It's your work. Good job.
Once they are in middle school, a more formal portfolio process also comes into play.
The 8th grade exhibition, portfolio exhibition process it's almost like a thesis review, where they have to defend their work. So they have an advisor that's a faculty member, they have their teacher, they have a family member, and then an outside community member.
You may need to explain that a little more. Okay. So you might want to think about a visual example to support your words.
As an 8th grader, this is Maurice's graduation portfolio. And
the student gets feedback, but as importantly, the instructor or the teacher gets feedback.
using a program called Real Studio, which uses Real Basic as a coding.
For this project, I was trying to figure out if you could make someone believe fake memories. I had a group of 5 people watch a video. 3 out of those 5 people, I had them tell the other person lies about what happened in the video. They didn't even realize, but they started to believe what I was telling them.
If there were 1 or 2 things that you could change about your experiment, what do you think would be most important to make it stronger scientifically?
I probably would have waited a longer time before I started asking them questions.
I am a psychologist and I also teach psychology in university. You had picked a really complex topic and you were so able to explain what you did, took all the different steps and looked for a different explanation.
Isolation is where you stop one of your body parts and then just move the rest. So technically, I chose dance for my Beyond the Classroom essay because it helped me to release my anger in a positive way. The government of Somalia is very poor, dealing with the Al-Shabaab, which is a militant group who's taken over most of the southern part of Somalia.
Malik? In the first sentence, you said that Somalia hasn't had a stable government in 21 years. Why did it fall apart?
I'm not quite sure because I didn't go that far back.
Did you do something that was different from what the book or what a website explained?
Actually, the circuits that I made worked better than the ones I saw.
What did you do when that happened?
At first I smiled and I was like, I said, yes, I did something new. And after that, I learned that you don't always have to follow the guide.
Assessments that call on a wide variety of skills and knowledge and which ask the students to evaluate their own learning and progress are far more meaningful and useful than merely testing what students can remember. Look, I get that the kind of changes I have been suggesting are drastically different from what we're doing now. And I get that any kind of change can be uncomfortable. It's so much easier to stick with what we perceive to be tried and tested methods, since they kinda sort of work. I mean, every year schools still produce graduates who become successful in their careers, even though the vast majority of those successes is in spite of school and not because of it. It's easy to say, well, this will never work, because it's so hard to imagine doing something different when we've stuck to the same things for hundreds of years. But it's precisely because we have barely changed for that long that it's time to look at whether the old assumptions still work under the new paradigms of this generation. Now, I acknowledge that the changes I'm calling for may not be for everybody. But as I said before, these things have been practiced to great success in many schools around the world. So we know they work. And it may just be the change some school needs to make to inject some life back into their classrooms. The payoff to authentic learning is worth the trouble of going through years of adjustment for both teachers and students to correct the problems of school that have been documented for decades. Yes, changing is hard. It's also necessary. Change like this requires time, a long time. The problem is, in the Philippines, we like immediate results. We don't have the patience to wait. K-12 has barely been in place more than a decade, and there's already talk of abolishing it. There is that familiar quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again while expecting different results. We can't just do things differently. It must be radically different. It's not about doing things better, it's about doing better things. The advantage of the changes I'm suggesting is, with the exception of the curriculum, they do not require legislation. Only the determination of teachers and administrators who want to do better things for their students. Yes, the government has to do its part in providing adequate funding and instituting better training for teachers. But innovation doesn't start at the top. It starts from the bottom with the people who do the dirty work, the teachers and students who see daily what is wrong with our education system. And if you feel the need to do something different, do it. Change your classrooms by doing better things. I call on the Dep Ed to allow schools the freedom to practice education in the best way possible for their respective students. By moving away from standardized and coerced to individualized and student-driven, when we let children choose how they want to be educated, we can reinstate joy in learning and fulfill Jose Rizal's vision of schools as not a torture chamber, but a playground of the mind.